All right, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all back to our afternoon session of the 8th Annual Sentinel Public Workshop. We've got a great session coming up now. You all heard this morning about some of the opportunities for the future in Sentinel involving going beyond the I guess I can say it now, the traditional work that Sentinel has been involved with around drug safety surveillance. This morning we heard from FDA leadership, Sentinel investigators, technical experts about Sentinel's use and value for better evaluating the safety of regulated medical products, but we also heard some about these new opportunities. And that's what we're going to focus on in this session. We're going to hear more about how Sentinel can be used beyond the regulation of drugs and biologics and can contribute, actually perhaps be a major foundational element of the broader evidence needs that a national system, a national learning healthcare system could accomplish. Emerging legislative and policy proposals like the 21st Century Cures Act and the upcoming user fee reauthorizations have all noted the importance of so-called real-world data and real-world evidence to help improve not just regulatory science and decision-making, but to help patients and clinicians make decisions, to help with many other important public policy issues that depend fundamentally on the quality of the evidence of medical products. The Sentinel system, which captures real-world data not only through claims, but as you heard today, increasingly additional electronic clinical data, laboratory data, in partnership with a growing range of data partners, has the potential to use this kind of longitudinal infrastructure as a national resource to support all of these other health system priorities. And that's what we're going to focus on in this session. We're very fortunate today to have leaders from the CDC, PCORI, NIH, the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and the FDA to talk about some of their work and opportunities for leveraging the Sentinel system for these broader public health and health improvement purposes. I'm very pleased to be joined by Susan Hariri, the Scientific Deputy Prevention Branch for the Division of Viral Hepatitis at the CDC, Joe Selby, the Executive Director of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, Catherine Myers, the Director of the Office of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health at the National Institutes of Health, Troy McCall, the Chief Implementation Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, and Melissa Robb, the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. We're going to start with some opening comments and in some cases slides to go with them from all of our panelists, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So Susan, can you start us off? Yeah, if you want to come on up, we should have your slides teed up right there.
Thank you. So I'm, as Mark mentioned, Susan Hariri. I'm from the Prevention Branch of the Division of Viral Hepatitis, and I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit this afternoon and talk about our efforts to monitor the HCV care cascade in the U.S. So just as a brief background, hepatitis C virus, or HCV, is a substantial, if often under-recognized, public health problem. Hepatitis C is the leading cause of chronic liver disease and hepatocellular carcinoma in the United States. And currently, about 3.5 million Americans are estimated to be living with chronic hepatitis C. Among adults, people who were born from between 1945 and 1965, or the so-called baby boomers, have the highest burden of disease. They have a prevalence that's 6 times as high of adults in other age groups. And the morbidity and mortality due to HCV has been steadily increasing, and in fact, HCV-related deaths now exceed deaths from all other reportable infectious diseases combined in the U.S. There is some good news, however. There are new opportunities to combat this so-called silent epidemic. First and foremost, we now have safe, well-tolerated, and highly effective drugs that have a over 90% cure rate. We also now have non-invasive tests that have replaced repeated liver biopsies for management of the disease and staging of liver disease. Also in 2012 and 2013, CDC and the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force changed or revised their guidelines to recommend one-time testing in the baby boomers, the people born between 1945 and 1965, to help with case detection. And finally, the ACA expansion has really provided a lot of opportunities for access to healthcare, especially people with chronic HCV are no longer denied access to healthcare for pre-existing conditions. So we in the Division of Viral Hepatitis are committed to making sure that people who are living with chronic hepatitis C are identified and linked to recommended care and treatment. And one way that we're doing this is through monitoring the HCV care cascade. And this is simply an approach to describe and quantify sequential steps in the spectrum of care from testing to cure. And it's a really elegant and useful tool to direct public health action by identifying gaps and barriers to progression along this spectrum of care, and also to implement strategies to improve progression. This has been done a lot in studies, mostly in patient cohorts or in small subgroups, but at the national level, there's really no single model or data source that can be used to monitor the cascade on this large scale. And likewise, there's no standard measures currently for monitoring the cascade nationally. And the estimates that you may have seen are mostly from combining studies that looked at either parts of the cascade or individual steps in the cascade. So just to give you an idea, from a national perspective, what we'd like to do is to start with population prevalence so that we can understand the underlying burden and the epidemiology of disease. And from there, we would look into whether the recommendations are being followed, whether the target populations are being tested, what the seroprevalence is in the population overall, and in subpopulations. And then the next big question is, are those who, with the positive antibody test, actually receiving appropriate follow-up with RNA testing to confirm chronic HCV? And then of those, what proportion are linked to care? What are the characteristics of people who are linked to care compared to those who are not? What are the barriers and predictors? And then, of course, what percent initiate treatment and what percent complete treatment? And finally, what percent are cured as measured by sustained virological response? And so this cascade is really very time limited. Depending on the disease stage and the genotype and some other clinical factors, it should really only take about 6 to 12 months. But we'd like to also look at beyond that to look at reinfection, long-term outcomes, and things like that. So we have a health services research team in the division that's actually working on developing a standardized approach and systematic methods to monitor the care cascade. And this is important to us because we do want to monitor this over time, and we want to look at trends, and we want to also be able to compare across geographic areas and settings and make sure that our messaging and our reporting is consistent over time. So the Health Services Research Group is now working to define the individual steps in the cascade. And this really is highly dependent on the setting, the population, the geographic area, and the data source. And so we're also trying to identify appropriate data sources in order to be able to monitor this at the national level. And the case-based surveillance for hepatitis is insufficient because it's, there's a lot of underreporting of hepatitis. Another thing that the group is working on is to select meaningful and measurable indicators for each step. And to the extent possible, we want to be able to provide regional, state, and local level data to inform policy and programs. So the data that we're currently exploring are basically what you've heard. Okay. So we have claims data, administrative claims data on commercially insured populations as well as the Medicare and Medicaid data. And as you heard this morning, we're really excited to be piloting a project with Sentinel using this rich resource and leveraging the infrastructure to monitor the care cascade. We also have electronic medical records. And another big source of data that we're exploring is data from large commercial reference laboratories that do testing in almost all states in the country. And then finally, we have pharmacy claims data. These are not at the patient level, and there's limited information in them, but they are useful to look at trends in prescriptions over patterns over time. So it looks like I'm out of time. I wanted to, and maybe we can get back to this, but basically this table shows the steps that I just went over and some of the ways that we would like to measure these steps, and then the data sources, availability of the data for the various steps. And I won't go into detail on this, but essentially what we've discovered is that we need multiple data sources in order to be able to construct a full care cascade. And be able to tell a full picture. So in summary, the HCV care cascade approach to monitoring progress to achieve benefits for the curative therapies and preventing HCV-related sequelae is underway. We're developing standard methodology and specific definitions for each step. We're exploring various data sources and how they can help us measure each step. And as I just said, we need access to several data sources of healthcare data in order to be able to look at the entire cascade. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. And next is Joe.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the annual meeting concerning Sentinel. I don't know if it means it's your birthday, but I will congratulate you as if it were, and congratulate the FDA for the vision in putting Sentinel together, Rich Platt and folks at Harvard Pilgrim for the coordinating center leadership, and all the I see a lot of Sentinel investigators in the audience. All of you for the years of hard work. I think it's safe to say that Sentinel has been groundbreaking in many ways. Really put the notion of the distributed data resource on the map, made the common data model a household word. A lot of it, methodologic research on how to, if you're going to distribute the data and not pool it all in one place, how in the world do you analyze it, leading in that, and a lot of work in validating outcomes and computable phenotypes a lot. So really set the standard. I used to be a Sentinel investigator before I left Kaiser and came here to PCORI. But as you've already heard from this morning, Sentinel, despite is a tough word, but with its 170 million lives, was funded initially for safety research and confined its activities to safety research with the FDA for a number of years, and is still largely restricted to claims data. I appreciate that there are some laboratory data and some EMR data within Sentinel, but the 170 million speaks to people who have claims data. This is very good data for safety, and there's a lot of good examples of safety studies, both showing no harm and some showing adverse effects that are done with claims data. But claims data are, as PCORI started thinking about it, claims data are really not the same in terms of efficiency for comparative effectiveness, where you're really worried about confounding by indication where the expected differences are much smaller. One needs more clinical detail, and worse than that, one often needs to do randomized trials to get at differences in effectiveness. As I started talking to people about the notion of PCORnet, I said there is a holy grail out there, and Sentinel and the investment FDA made, the Collaboratory with the investment that NIH made, and a number of other investments made by industry and other funders all speak to the notion that those data are out there, and we should be able to capture them for multiple uses. And PCORnet funded by PCORI, is in some ways a sort of a second generation attempt to get at that. But the big news today, I think, is that the Holy Grail now is collaboration among these. But I'll say a little bit about PCORnet. We started just the reverse of Sentinel. Rather than going to health plans and getting claims data, we went to healthcare delivery systems and got EMR data. EMRs, by the time we got started, EMRs had spread to about 75% of the office population and even higher fraction of hospital care. So it made sense. But just as I said, there are limitations to claims data. The limitations to EHR data alone are much more severe, much greater. There are undoubtedly, I know there are types of research one can do with EMR data only, but most of them aren't longitudinal, and most of them certainly don't have to do with comparative effectiveness. When we issued the funding announcement, we basically said to applicants, you've got to have EMR data on 1 million people and tell us about your claims data. And the winners actually believed that they had access to claims data and could get it. The reality, they may have had letters that said we will share data. The reality did not pan out to be so. And so we realized 12 months in that we were needed a new solution for bringing claims data. And that's where Sentinel, with whom we shared a coordinating center, by the way, and with whom we shared a common data model, comes in. So claims data are needed, as you well know, to create a sampling frame, the actual population, to identify the outcomes comprehensively, to get complete data on covariates and past medical history, and to even know that you're still following the person. You can't know that in EMR alone. So what are we doing? We've issued an announcement. There are people in the audience right now preparing applications for this announcement, and it's directed specifically to Sentinel members, health plan members, to join PCORnet. We will, mid-year, we will award 2 awards to 2 Sentinel members, and we will work hard within PCORnet and with Sentinel and the Coordinating Center to accomplish that work of linkage. And the work behind that, which means getting a health plan and a delivery system to agree that this is an important study that you want to lend your data to. That part excites us a lot. Just in closing, other key aspects of PCORnet that differ a little bit from Sentinel, we put an emphasis, because we're PCORI, on engagement early on. Several reasons. One is we think that engagement makes the research better. We're going to be using patients' data. They need to know about it and have a say over it. Also, we're aiming to do clinical trials, so the systems need to know. They need to agree to have a clinical trial going on in their midst. We have demonstration projects underway. One is a large randomized trial, 2 doses of aspirin for preventing secondary prevention of heart disease, 2 very large multi-center observational studies in obesity, a health systems project. That's actually a set of 4 pilot projects, and a very large investment in our patient-powered research networks, their projects. We actually have a couple examples now of externally funded research going on within PCORnet, and we expect that will, we really feel that it must take off this year. So you will see other users, as was always our plan, funding research within PCORnet, a bit now, a lot more by the end of the year. So I look forward to discussions with my other colleagues and you.
Thanks, Joe. And next up is Kathy.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the day today. It's been extremely informative of the scope and remarkable progress of the Sentinel efforts, and I'm delighted to be here today to tell you a bit about the Collaboratory program and its early exploration into using the amazing distributed data infrastructure that's been created within Sentinel. I think I have slides. Where could I find them? Oh, thank you very much. It's great. So again, I need to introduce you to a bit about the Collaboratory program. I think unlike many of the efforts you've heard discussed today, the Collaboratory is not a network. It is a collection of pragmatic clinical trials that are being conducted in partnership with integrated healthcare systems around the U.S. and that have been embedded within the usual clinical care setting. The overall Collaboratory effort is a common fund effort from the NIH. It began in 2012, and it began with the goal to really strengthen the national capacity to implement cost-effective, large-scale research studies that engage healthcare delivery systems as research partners. Along these lines, these aims are really to provide a framework for implementation methods, best practices that will enable the participation of many different kinds of healthcare systems in clinical research. And clearly, research conducted in partnership with these healthcare systems is really essential to strengthen the relevance of the research to advancing healthcare and to healthcare practice. Now, if we take a broad scope and look at the map of the U.S., there are really two observations I'd like to call your attention to here. One, the Collaboratory is now a collection of 9 pragmatic clinical trials that have been launched around the U.S. The star over North Carolina, if you will, is Duke University, that functions as the coordinating center for all of the Collaboratory program. And as the NIH is constituted by 27 different institutes and centers, these pragmatic trials span many different disciplines, from suicide prevention to care of ESRD, the management of patients with chronic pain, and a variety of disorders consistent with our overall mission. And we have quite a heterogeneous mix of NIH scientists that are involved in the program. Now, if one looks at the healthcare partners, healthcare system partners that have come to the table with the projects, we see a very diverse group of organizations, many of which are familiar to those involved in the Sentinel program. And the requirements for participating in the Collaboratory is that each of the NIH investigators establish these partnerships with the healthcare systems in which they work, and then brought all of their ideas together, and each were required to work across at least 2 different healthcare systems in order to push forward the methods for integrating electronic healthcare data and records across different systems. Now, the Coordinating Center program is really run by the Coordinating Center, which was given a charge of 3 distinct tasks. One is to provide the national leadership and really the technical expertise in all aspects of research with healthcare systems. They also have been very effective in not only the planning, but the implementation of all of these trials within the NIH Collaboratory. And finally, a very important bullet item here is to make available the data, tools, and resources from these as well as other projects in order to facilitate future research, the planning and cooperation of additional healthcare systems and investigators in conducting additional research. So if one peruses the Collaboratory DRN website, here's a screenshot of what the Coordinating Center has been working on, very ably led by Rich Platt and his team for the DRN. This, I guess, is as one looks at this, clearly the team is beginning to put process to vision, if you will, of organizing, bringing investigators to the table to develop processes whereby they can engage and begin using such a tool. And similarly, if one peruses the website, there are a number of the existing partners for the Sentinel system that have expressed an interest in further exploring the options of working with such an NIH resource of a distributed data network for future research in NIH, and not only in the planning, but also the implementation of future studies. Now, again, this is perhaps a slide we've seen earlier today, which again shows a strategy and a vision for how all of these partners may work together. The existing infrastructure of Mini Sentinel, now graduated to the Sentinel level, as we heard this morning, the NIH Distributed Research Network, as well as other networks and sponsors that participate. And each organization can participate with multiple networks, and controlling of the infrastructure and individual governance is clearly an important aspect of this, as well as continuing to share generalizable knowledge, what we're learning, and additional tasks of data curation, analytics, and lessons learned. So I leave this as a final slide for us to sort of focus on this final charge to our Collaboratory Coordinating Center, which really focuses on the tool development and resources for the general research community. As we heard this morning, both Janet Woodcock and Rich Platt in his comments, that these tasks require the cooperation and collaboration of multidisciplinary teams across various agencies and organizations. And clearly, leveraging of such vital and important infrastructure is going to be a very large aspect of planning future research. And so I think I'll close with that, and I'm happy to bring the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathy. And next is Troy.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us today. This is not my 8th birthday, but it is my 4th birthday being part of this great program. And it's really exciting to see the progress that's been made, and it's also equally exciting to have been at least a small part of the progress that's been made. So today I'd like to share with you the progress that we've been making specifically on IMEDS, the Innovation in Medical Evidence Development and Surveillance Program at the Reagan-Udall Foundation. For those of you who may not be familiar with IMEDS, it is a public-private partnership that was basically established to help us build upon all the great progress that's been made historically, starting with Sentinel, now Sentinel, also through the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, or OMOP, that was created largely by industry a number of years ago at the time that Sentinel was stood up. And so we've created this public-private partnership that consists of 3 sub-programs. The first program is IMEDS Methods, and as its name would imply, this is where we facilitate the development of methods as well as the refinement of methods to help in safety surveillance. And Janet mentioned earlier today the importance of methods research, and I can't begin to emphasize that as well, but that's not really the purpose of what we're going to talk about today. The second stool of the second leg of the three-legged stool, or the stool, is IMEDS education. And as you can imagine, although this is an exciting area of science, it's a small but growing area of science, and we feel that we need to play a special role in expanding the research community. And then the third area where we are going to spend the time today talking about is IMEDS evaluation. Specifically, Janet and others have talked today about how Sentinel was always intended from day one to be a national resource. In order to leverage Sentinel as a national resource to non-FDA stakeholders, we've created the IMEDS evaluation program that will allow non-FDA stakeholders to be able to use the same tools and methods as exist within Sentinel. Like Sentinel, we're using a distributed database, a distributed data network. We've partnered, not surprisingly, with Harvard Pilgrim. They've been an amazing partner throughout this journey. And we've also established partnerships with the same data partners that exist within Sentinel. An overview of our pilot project. So not unlike Sentinel, we also thought it would be important to start in a thoughtful manner with a pilot project. This pilot project for IMEDS evaluation has been graciously supported by Pfizer. It consists of 2 phases. The first phase is development of the policies and procedures which would ultimately guide how we govern, how we communicate, and how we operationalize the system. And then the second is to actually put those policies and procedures to the test by posing 2 demonstration cases. The data partners have been engaged. Harvard Pilgrim has been engaged, obviously, as well. So in phase 1, we, again, created this in order to establish the policies and procedures for how we're going to oversee the project. We have gotten to what we call the final first draft, and we use that final first draft of the policies and procedures to guide phase 2 of the pilot project. But some of the things that we've learned since the time that we issued that final first draft, and I see Elizabeth smiling because this first one was certainly one that she highlighted for us, is that we need to make sure that the governance structure is not too unwieldy, and we need to make sure that it allows us to operate in a streamlined and efficient manner. So we're going to work on that as well. We do need a better description of exactly how the data partners will participate, when they will begin participating. And we also need to make sure that we're including a robust communication plan for how we will disseminate the results of any query. So phase 2 is where we actually performed, again, posed a couple of queries to the system. Reagan-Udall, as well as the data partners, were required to get IRB approval, and I'll say another word on that in just a moment. We have now, just very recently, within the last few days, have received results from phase 2, so we're very excited about that. And Rich, thank you for the plug earlier on that one. And the final study report will be submitted and shared with the public, as all future results of any IMEDS evaluation query will occur. So I am running a little bit short on time. I want to make sure that I'm able to talk about what we're going to be doing next. But again, the data partners have been involved. Research versus public health authority is an area that we do want to spend a little bit more time on. We did have to get IRB approval. If we had public health authority or were recognized as such, we wouldn't have to do that, but that's not the only reason. The other reason to have this status is it would ensure that all the data within each of the data partners' repositories would be made available for such queries. In terms of communication, we are going to be holding a stakeholder meeting in the second quarter to basically discuss our policies and procedures, do a lessons learned, and determine how we can build upon the progress that we've made up to this point as we look to roll out IMEDS evaluation into full production mode. The pilot project manuscript will be submitted, and so all of you will obviously have an opportunity to review that. Results will be disseminated directly to FDA, again, as would always be the case with any query posed within IMEDS evaluation, as well as being made available to the public. So what we're going to be doing next is this quarter, we're going to be finalizing the policies and procedures. We're also going to be completing the first draft of the manuscript. Next quarter, as mentioned previously, we're going to be holding an in-person stakeholder meeting to ensure that everybody who has an interest in how this program will be rolled out has an opportunity to have their voices heard. We'll continue discussions with basically OHARP in terms of determining if there can be public health status granted. And then lastly, we'll establish the necessary infrastructure that will be required to roll the program out into full production mode so that IMEDS evaluation later this year can be made available to all non-FDA stakeholders. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks, Troy. And last but not least on the panel, Melissa.
Thank you. So I guess I'm here to wrap it up a little bit about some of these different projects. Like Janet mentioned this morning, it's not new for FDA to be talking about the desire for Sentinel to evolve into a national resource. Although Sentinel grew out of a congressional mandate for safety purposes, FDA is already starting to think about other uses of the data to better understand the performance of the products that we regulate. And so it only makes sense that there will be others outside of FDA who have similar interests in using these data for different purposes. And so we fully support that. So as we move from mini Sentinel to Sentinel, we've also been starting to think about other opportunities that FDA has. And I think it might have been mentioned that collaboration is where we see a huge opportunity to maximize the investments that we and others have made in this data and to realize efficiencies and to really enrich the types of data and the quantity of data we have access to. So as Joe mentioned, Sentinel is very heavily claims data focused, but as we bring in more richer types of data from electronic health records, we can also benefit from using the investment that PCORI has made in those types of partners. So I think that's where we're focused now is this opportunity that we have to work with all these groups up here and others who have been working in this space. So we put together some slides that kind of show kind of our vision in that area. And we like to think of different nodes that we can be leveraging. And just thinking about that a little, Kaiser is one example where there's many different Kaiser sites that contribute to the database, and that they're able to give that data for analysis for FDA for safety purposes, but we can imagine other purposes also. And that, then another important component of this is that patients and providers are getting the feedback they need to inform their healthcare decisions. And so when we think about that, really the close work and interactions with the different data partners and the healthcare environments is a key component. So within Sentinel, we might work with a bunch of nodes and who are helped by a collaborating center, so that would enable those type of connections to happen. Oops. Oh well. And so, but then as we think about different groups, such as the National Device Evaluation System that Greg talked about this morning, and CDRH trying to leverage those connections, there's overlap in the different types of partners. It might have a different coordinating center, but the nature of the data is interoperable in a way that we can all leverage the investments that each other are making. And that's really where we're thinking and focusing a lot of our time now thinking about is how we can make those investments and maximize those. So the CoreNet, similar slides, some overlap. Joe even mentioned that they have a specific targeted engagement to some of the Sentinel data partners with a coordinating center that could be leveraged by others. And so, we could go on and on. There's with different projects, but that's really where we're hoping to focus right now and be able to have different types of data available for broader purposes. So I want to thank everybody for coming.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks all of you for some very interesting comments and highlighting a lot of further directions for Sentinel as part of a national neural network. I would like to talk for a few minutes before opening this up to a broader discussion with people in the audience, many of whom are participating in this effort in some way, and I know are thinking about some of these kinds of extensions. Think about some of the challenges to get from where we are now to that kind of network that Melissa just showed, with a lot of nodes participating smoothly in a wide range of evidence development activities, from safety and effectiveness of drugs to better evidence on devices to better evidence for public health to supporting practical clinical trials and comparative effectiveness research. It's quite an expansive vision. What do you all see? I guess I think about a lot of the challenges in addressing problems like this is having coming in at least a couple of flavors. One is the technical side. So what are the particular challenges around things like data interoperability? Melissa, you mentioned that. Linkages of different types of data elements, the kinds of data elements needed for one study, one type of study versus another may differ, more clinical, more financial, UDIs, technical issues like that versus I guess what might be called motivational obstacles. So this is hard work. We know it takes resources, but even with technical issues addressed, probably the motivation for the resources and the motivation to work together, that can present some challenges too. And I'd like to spend a few minutes on each of those in turn. Maybe starting with views is about the biggest technical challenges to getting to the kind of vision that you all have laid out. Anybody want to start?
So I'm not a technical expert. I think we're very fortunate, though, that there are a lot of people that have been investing in this in many different ways. ONC and ASPE, in particular from the department, have done a lot of work around supporting core projects and doing things around linking, and we've been fortunate to be involved in some of those projects. So I think the technical issues, I think, are surmountable, but challenging. But I think that it's an exciting era to be in, where we have all this data and that people are really driven to develop capabilities to turn it into evidence to inform how we take care of patients.
And I can.
Go ahead.
So I think that within the Collaboratory, each of the investigators brought their data partners, and I think I'm not a technical person per se as well in dealing with the data sets, but clearly within the coordinating center, we established core work groups that dealt with the electronic health record and data phenotypes. And we found that this was critical work that occurred within healthcare systems, that it was quite an impressive undertaking that each of the data partners in those trials really had dedicated people to work with investigators and clinicians in order to establish best practices and methods. Now again, these trials are across many different disciplines, but they all faced very similar kinds of issues with how clean the data is, the quality of the data. And so I think it really took this multiple disciplinary team and the work groups working across the different projects. And I think from a data perspective, that was, I think, very fruitful.
I'll just add to that a bit. I think the common data model that Sentinel first stood up was based largely on claims data, which looked messy at the time, but when you I'm channeling Rich completely here, but in contrast to claims data, electronic health record data are infinitely messier. There are no standards really driving most of the data entry. There's no common practices across centers, even with the same delivery system. And there are a lot of concepts that really are the richness in the electronic health record that have never been standardized anywhere. So building a common data model on and I think this is exactly what you're saying, building a common data model on the EHR side is very different than a common data model on the plan side, and takes a lot more time and effort. It's going to be a really incremental effort, probably almost a just-in-time or as-you-need-it type of standardization, project by project. That's why I think we're very excited by the idea of getting the project started. And I mean, places like Kaiser, who've been doing this work, have done a lot of work toward getting good data out of EHRs, but there's an awful lot left to do, and particularly thinking that PCORNet has 13 clinical data research networks. Most of them have never tried this kind of research before. They're most academics, federally qualified health centers, community hospitals, and delivery systems. So a lot of work on the EHR standardization front.
So,
Go ahead, Troy.
yeah, sorry. I really can't add anything to what's already been said about the technical complexities of bringing these data sets together. Historically, these data were never intended to be used in the way in which they're being used now. But what I would focus on is what I said at the beginning of my brief presentation, and also to reiterate what Janet said earlier, and that is we cannot lose sight of the importance of developing the right methods to assess the data. Once we have all the data in a single place, if we don't have the right methods to evaluate the data, then having all the data in the same place under the same common data model really is not going to result in the outcome that we're seeking.
Yeah, build on, I think, I'm not sure this is a technical issue, but several of you raised issues related to whether this is research or public health and where are those lines. Troy talked about this explicitly. Joe, Kathy, I know in your work with randomization, that's probably more explicitly research. Do we have the methods in place and well understood to think about where these different types of learning activities fit in, or are there challenges there that still need to be addressed? I mean, I took from the earlier comments, this is hard, but technically difficult, but we're making steady progress. What about on these issues of classifying activities as research and on addressing necessary issues around informed consent and engagement of the public?
I guess I can take a first stab at that. Within the Collaboratory, we've had a very active ethics and regulatory work group that have been thinking about what the appropriate level of oversight and ethical considerations for pragmatic trials, and considering some elements of our current regulatory framework and definitions of terms such as minimal risk, and how one handles informing patients and informed consent in these kinds of studies. And we've engaged our colleagues at across agencies, both at CMS and at FDA and certainly at OHARP over these last few years, to have a lot of conversation about the current trials that are in the Collaboratory and how the ethical oversight and the questions about the ethical oversight fits into our current framework. And I think there certainly is much work that needs to be done. Some of the trials posed very interesting questions and has been a very a sort of focus of lively conversation and dialogue about our current regulatory framework.
Well, I would just add, for several reasons, I don't think we've considered even asking whether these activities that we're particularly interested in sponsoring maybe are not research, they're more public health activity. I think we are trying to promote the notion that one can and ought to do research with these data. As you said, a lot of it is randomized trials to start with, so that's a no-brainer. But even the large observational studies, the million-person observational studies, I think our tack has been with patients involved at every step in PCORI and PCORNet. That's not quite the right strategy. I think oversight is very different than individual level informed consent, and I think clarifying when individual level informed consent is absolutely necessary, and when it's a part of good practice in healthcare, but does not need informed consent is where we've put our
And what
money.
constitutes informed consent?
And what constitutes informed consent, and sometimes what might alternatives to individual informed consent be? Same question, but I think if there delivery systems that own data and want that data used in research need to find ways to let their members or patients know that the data are being used securely. The data are secure, but they are being used for some of these purposes.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up comment, I think the patient component of the research enterprise is a very important piece of this. Janet raised it earlier in her comments this morning about letting the public know about existing efforts in Sentinel. And I think the corollary to that is how all of this work might be interrelated and used for research purposes, and that engaging patients in this process is really critical.
I mean, so obviously Sentinel had to deal with this from the outset, and it's deemed a public health activity by OHARP, and there's implications for that. As we start to think about doing projects outside of Sentinel for non-safety, we're having to revisit how this oversight and protection would work. And so we're starting to think about that again. And I think that's something always that's important. You know, we realize that these data are essential for our purposes and for the new ways we're trying to think about how patients react to and our the safety and effectiveness of products, and how when those are used in outside of the traditional clinical trial settings. So, and the privacy and security of the data that we're accessing is very important. So we wanted to think about it, and we're going to continue to think about it in kind of this new paradigm when we're outside of the safety world.
All right, well, we've talked about some of the technical challenges to getting there from here. We've talked about some very important issues related to definitions of research and ways of informing and engaging patients. Let me talk about more fundamental issues around motivation. It sounds like what a lot of the work that all of these activities have in common is that they are important questions for public health, medical decision making, and the like that can't either easily be answered or can't be answered at all by individual nodes, to use Melissa's terminology, by these nodes working by themselves. But that may not be enough to get everybody to work together. Do you all see in the work that you're doing any ways of maybe overcoming either institutional barriers or financial or economic incentives that are moving in the wrong direction or not doing as much as they could to support these kinds of efforts?
this is, again, an area I think we have to thank our colleagues at Harvard Pilgrim and Rich Platt's group, because they did a lot of work, I think, engaging with different data partners and keeping them involved from the onset. I think that there are a lot of challenges. You know, we've heard from our data partners that they don't want different requests coming in for access to their data in different ways. So this is where we see the real big opportunity, is like leveraging one type of approach to transforming and utilizing that data, so that they don't have to answer a question from FDA in one way and answer a similar question from NIH or other private groups in a different way. So to the extent that we can be efficient with our ask of the people that are stewards of this data, I think that that's really an opportunity for us.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Joe. So when FDA poses a question and the data partners receive that, that's one thing, I think, in the eyes of the data partners. But when it comes to a non-FDA stakeholder presenting a query, in the case of some data partners, I think there is some degree of skepticism about, you know, what really is the intent behind this query. If it's directly for competitive purposes, they're not going to have any interest in whatsoever in that. But at the end of the day, we've always, I'll just go back to the beginning, we've always talked about leveraging Sentinel as a national resource and having non-FDA stakeholders and industry in particular be given the opportunity to work in a more collaborative fashion with FDA. But to get to the point, that's kind of the issue, but to get to how we might be able to address that, I think the data partners in the case of IMED's evaluation are going to look for more transparency earlier in the process. They're going to want to have a complete and deep understanding of why is this question important to be answered. They're going to want answers to questions like, is FDA interested in this question? Are they going to be interested in the results? Same for EMA and other global regulatory agencies. So I think what we're going to have to do is just ensure that there's greater transparency up front, so that at the end of the day, data partners understand that the work that we're trying to do and that industry is trying to do in this case is work to improve patients' lives and even save patients' lives, because that's, at the end of all this, that's what it comes down to.
So at the very first meeting we ever held, July 2012, to discuss the possibility of a network like this, some smart person stood up and said, you know, for a network like this to work, there has to be something in it for everybody that has to contribute. So there has to be something in it for patients, there has to be something in it for clinicians, there has to be something in it for systems. So I think we've perhaps pushed even a little farther into the idea that delivery systems ought to be aware that this research is going on. Both because they do have proprietary interests, but also because that helps them get an appreciation of what their data can contribute to. But beyond that, they also have to have the option of asking and answering questions. So far we've gotten extraordinarily positive reactions to the leaders from the leaders of delivery systems about PCORNet and about working with the PCORNet researchers in their systems on questions of mutual interest. With the introduction of plans, there's a new set of questions, because these are business associates that, that to some extent have competing interests. So am I going to share my delivery system data with, some major national health plan? Well, it better be pretty clearly defined what that use is going to be, and I better be convinced that the shared data will be used for only that purpose. That, I think, is the biggest non-technical challenge, is how one gets at sharing data. Now, we sense a lot of interest in doing it, and I think part of it is because health plans and delivery systems are sharing data increasingly around issues of shared risk, accountable care organizations, et cetera. So you see a fair amount of it already. And we just have to nudge a little further to say, wouldn't it be interesting to address research questions of mutual interest, and then hopefully a little bit down the road from that is, isn't research in general worth doing with this data now that we've put the infrastructure together? So we look forward to those dialogues between delivery systems and plans once they're both, once we've figured out ways to sort of bring Pecorinet delivery systems together with particularly Sentinel payer partners, but others as well.
Thanks, great. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Just as a follow-up, I think the experience in the Collaboratory is we had 9 investigators who clearly had relationships with the healthcare systems in which they were working and were asking important questions to the healthcare systems and the people running the healthcare systems. So I think that these stakeholder interactions are at times very complicated, but important that healthcare systems clearly have a very strong interest in what these questions are and can work with these teams.
Some great points. We have some time for questions and comments, so for those of you who have any, please head up to the microphone and again, identify who you are when you ask the question. Please go ahead.
Forget the compliments then.
Said some very nice things about everybody involved in this effort.
Anyway, my questions really are practical. So if we understand that there is growing knowledge within several groups at FDA about the importance of using data just in the Sentinel, forget all of the other possible linkages. And if we have this wonderful IMEDS evaluation project, which is going to finally allow industry to be able to ask questions of the network, then can we handle the volume? Is there the capacity in the coordinating center? Is there the capacity at the data partners where I know resources can be tight and it's not their main mission to do this research? And so what are the plans if there isn't that capacity? What are the plans for prioritizing, or will we end up with only the research that is of greatest interest to the government and the individual health plans being what gets done, or are we going to truly be able to have this national resource?
Good question. Troy, Melissa, what's the capacity?
I mean, I think those are good points. Those are things that we're going to have to work out. I mean, FDA, kind of when we started some of these, I can think of, we alluded to this in one of the policies, that data partners can use the data that we invested to transform into the Sentinel Common Data Model, but, FDA, they have to meet the requirements of our contract, and FDA has some priority and expectation in that. So as you think about multiple coordinating centers accessing this kind of networked or neural or whatever you call it, those are the types of things that have to be identified. I mean, there are limitations that will probably ease up as we get more familiar with it and as we have better ways and more complex ways to analyze it. But we definitely haven't gotten there, that we've had to figure those things out yet. I'm hopeful that, that there would, those are the types of policy issues you'd have to decide. Who decides? Is it always FDA, or or is it there's some governing board that considers the question and the urgency of it for public health in general, and FDA would have to take a back seat. And I think we kind of worked through some of those as we've stood up governance for different projects like OMOP, or as IMEDS is thinking about it. But it just gets, I guess, more and more complex the more people you bring to the table that have to figure this out.
Yeah, and from the IMEDS perspective, while we are in the process of laying out the operational framework, we also have to create a business model that will allow the program to be supported. And as part of that business model to support the program, obviously we do have to take into consideration resources that may or may not be available at Harvard Pilgrim, resources that well, frankly, probably are not available at Harvard Pilgrim today, are not available at the data partners today. So we're going to have to ensure that our business model will allow us on day one to create that limited infrastructure that will allow us to respond to queries in a timely manner. Because one thing that we haven't talked about that non-FDA stakeholders have made very clear to us as we've developed the IMEDS evaluation program is it's not just okay to respond to a query. We need the query to be responded to in real-time or near-time fashion, because that's the only way that we can that's the only way that we can act, basically. So it's in progress, but we understand that it's a critical issue.
So I, as a former Sentinel investigator, maybe I can address this too. And coming from a place where there really was a lot going on before Sentinel came along, your question is so critically important. It's part of what we mean when we say there has to be something in it for everyone. Beyond that, though, I don't think, I think there's a number of research shops which will never get totally excited about being part of a national resource unless they are really part of it, really embedded in it, and really getting a lot out. So there's part of it that's culture change at the national level, 21st century research culture rather than 20th century culture. But what that actually means in terms of getting the large community of researchers across the country to trust each other more and to be willing to go through the extra pain of doing multi-center research when maybe they could do it by themselves. All of that is part of it, and I think that's why engagement of all these people is part of the answer.
It is a different research culture. Please go ahead.
Kevin Haynes, Health Corps. There's smoke coming out of our servers, answering as many questions as possible right now. My question is really from a front door perspective. Where do we go to keep? I mean, I know this is front and center with PCORI for sustainability, but why do I come to PCORI versus coming to IMEDS versus coming to the NIH Collaboratory? And Melissa, when you had the slide up with the multiple coordinating centers, do you envision a day where we actually do sort of have multiple front doors into the systems?
So I personally, and we haven't had like broad discussions, but I think that coordinating centers should be thought of, who are they, who is requesting this access to the data and for what purposes. And so under that model, Sentinel was FDA asking a safety question. And we've talked a little bit about FDA kind of expanding, and we're saying, well, this Guardian program would be FDA asking a non-safety question. So then you would establish governance under those. I think they'll look very similar. I think there are some areas that there will have to be differences, and we kind of touched on this, but really, so what is the appropriate oversight for a non-safety FDA activity? I think some of those will probably still be considered public health activities, but sometimes they might not be, and then we have to think about that. So those are things that we didn't have to deal with in Sentinel. So that's kind of how I think coordinating centers would be. So you could think of, research activities, comparative effect, and maybe that overcomplicates it, or maybe it doesn't. I think those are the types of things we have to tackle with. But I think as much as we can be kind of aligned in how we're asking data partners to do their, access their data for us, is how we can help. I mean, if everybody's doing it in a different format and there's no kind of standardization, I think that this issue of that Elizabeth raised will never be solved, and it will just compound that. So that's where I hope we get. I think it's a long-term goal. I don't think it's a short-term issue.
I think because PCORNet from the beginning aimed to do all manner of research, aimed to create a network where you could do surveillance, you could do safety, you could do CER, observational or randomized, even do etiologic research if you were inclined to fund that kind of research. I think we've seen from the beginning, and this is kind of back to the culture change, that the really large vision is going to mean that ultimately there are multiple front doors to this, and there's less centralization. I mean, PCORI may go away, the word PCORNet may go away. We hope that multiple health care delivery system networks across the land using a common data model continue. Right now, within PCORNet, collaborative research groups are developing. You call them centers of excellence. But when the diabetes researchers in PCORNet are really unified and they have a virtual or geographic center, that may be the front door. They may well still rely on a coordinating center, but I think there's one in mental health, there's one in pediatrics, one in heart disease, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The idea, ultimately, you'd want a group of experts affiliated with PCORNet in every single area, and they'd be the experts on evaluating the utility of a study and guiding along with the, the investigator, the PI, the conduct of the study. So,
Joe, you mentioned that other funders were starting to explore use of the PCORNet infrastructure. Is that kind of what you have in mind? These are groups that can be where the aggregation across an area of clinical interest or a type of data or type of study.
The one that's really a done deal and underway is with the CDC. It's the Division of Diabetes Translation. And 6 PCORNet CDRNs are now part of a network called the Natural Experiments Network, along with 3 other non-PCORNet sites working on natural experiments, actually, variation in approaches to care for patients with type 2 diabetes. And it's spawned the coalescence of the diabetes investigators within PCORNet as kind of a byproduct.
Go ahead.
Sure. Ted Heisey with Cook Medical. And Mark, I thought you framed one of the issues really well in terms of the sort of the line between public health and research and the level of patient awareness to assent to consent. And I guess I'm wondering if anyone on the panel might want to comment on the timing of the revision of the common rule that's currently underway and the possibility of trying to get some of these issues a little more well vetted in the whole national system.
Regulatory research enterprise. Kathy, you want to take that?
I can certainly take a first pass effort. I think that the overall goal of the proposed revisions to the common rule have focused around two aspects of our current framework. One is the need to provide information to patients of what's actually happening in the research enterprise and make this more clearly communicated to patients. And the other is what has, over the last couple of decades, created sort of an administrative burden, if you will, in institutions for the research process, and a serious attempt to make the oversight process more commensurate with the risks of research. And so I think that the proposed revisions to the legislation are a step toward that.
Any other comments on the topic? Kathy, you want to expand on, have you, in terms of the feedback on the regulation, proposed regulation, accomplishing those goals, any major themes that you're seeing? Or?
Well, I think this is, so the public comment for the proposed changes ended in December, and they're currently, I think currently there's quite a bit of work going on, and I anticipate we'll hear something later in the calendar year. But it was, I think there was quite a stream of comments coming in about the proposed legislation.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you all very much. Certainly a lot going on and a lot of interesting things coming in the future. All right. We're going to reset up here for just a couple of minutes, so this is a good time to stretch, but not run off. So we're restarting in like 2 minutes.